Coming up on the Sky News Daily with me, Neil Paterson. As the BBC publishes the results of an internal review following the Huw Edwards scandal, we ask, why does it keep happening? And will it ever stop?
You asked and we listened.
The first 100 days of Trump 2.0 is almost over, but we're not done yet.
So we're keeping the podcast going every weekday at 6 a.m.
Join us to stay up to date with the latest twists and turns.
For interviews and analysis.
And stories from across the United States.
You can listen to Sky News Trump 100 now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, good evening. After days of talking about an unnamed BBC presenter at the centre of allegations around paying a teenager for sexually explicit pictures, tonight that presenter has been named as Huw Edwards. The revelation was made...
Now, as you might imagine, the BBC took that very seriously and in 2024 announced they were setting up a review. Its findings have just been published. But Edwards was not the only big name to move from the spotlight to the shadows.
Now, MasterChef star Greg Wallace has responded to allegations of inappropriate behaviour against him in a post on social media.
And of course, it didn't end there. Despite the historical crimes of Jimmy Savile, it appears that other figures simply weren't investigated enough.
The BBC, and this is about the former Radio 1 DJ Tim Westwood. The BBC board has now apologised after a review into what the broadcaster knew about concerns over the former DJ's conduct.
None of which is to imply that these problems are specific or unique to the BBC. But on the day in which its own internal review identified no toxic culture in the organisation, it's probably worth asking if these presenter scandals will ever stop. Katie Spencer is our arts and entertainment correspondent. Katie, another day, another review at the BBC. Remind us about this one and just why it was started.
This review was set up after the ex-newsreader Huw Edwards pleaded guilty to accessing child abuse images. In the wake of all of that scandal, they launched this deep dive review basically into workplace culture, the results of which have been published today. Lo and behold, they have come to the conclusion that the BBC does not have a toxic culture when it comes to being able to call out the sort of power imbalance between sort of staff and talent at the top, if you like. But I think some of the quotes are rather more sort of damning, really. If you look at some of the employees that are quoted within this review, they talk about knowing things like the code of conduct, but not actually really knowing what these sort of things mean in terms of actually the action that you can take. One employee is quoted as pointing out the difference between pay being absolutely huge between that of the stars and that of the sort of lower end of things like producers. One's quoted as saying the actual and perceived value of the presenter versus the producer, how empowered really is a producer to raise and address issues. Another staff member points out things like the current process of reporting in itself is traumatising, as they put it, unsupportive, overly long, with relentless rounds of meetings, assessments and uncertainty. So while they sort of say that there's no evidence of a toxic culture at the BBC, certainly I think from some of the quotes that you get when you look at this report, certainly does feel like a lot of the employees feel like they can't really come forward and sort of honestly speak their mind if there are occasions when bad behaviour is happening.
All of which to me suggests, Katie, that issues with behaviour in the BBC workplace extend far beyond accusations levelled at Huw Edwards. Well, we knew that already though, didn't we?
Absolutely. Look, we've had so many other reviews into other bad behaviour as well. Things like Russell Brand, who obviously now is facing criminal charges but denies any wrongdoing. We've had a review into his time as a radio presenter at the BBC, and that found that a number of staff felt unable to raise concerns. In January, of course, we also had a review into the behaviour of the former BBC DJ Tim Westwood, which found that the corporation did not take adequate action over his behaviour then. Look, there's so many instances where people certainly don't feel like they can come forward and actually sort of call out the behaviour of its talent. What I do think is interesting as well as to this report is if you compare it back to the last big workplace culture report that they gave in 2013, which obviously came in the wake of the Jimmy Savile abuse being exposed. They're very similar. Have you taken a look at the two?
Yes, I have, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you take the sort of 2025 recommendations that are in this one today, it's things like the Call It Out campaign for bad behaviour that they mentioned, that is a campaign to get people to report bullying, not too dissimilar to the 2013 promise they made to publicise the routes to support bullying, is how they put it there. Look, if you take the report today, they're saying there's going to be new pledges for individuals, setting out what they can expect from the BBC. Does that or does that not sound very similar to back then when they promised to relaunch the BBC Values? I just think it's another one of these occasions where the BBC has spent a lot of money and come to conclusions which are very similar to the conclusions that they came to over a decade ago now. I think the telling thing will be whether we actually see any sort of real change coming through. Certainly, I don't know if you saw the Samir Shah, the BBC chair, his quote that he gave talking about his sort of intentions going forward. He said, in the end, it's quite simple. If you're a person who is prepared to abuse power or punch down or behave badly, there is no place for you at the BBC. But we should stress, shouldn't we, that these are issues that are playing out in businesses and in newsrooms across the country. I mean, look, ITN within the last couple of years has been called out for using NDAs and to...
What's an NDA?
NDA, non-disclosure agreements. They were originally brought in to protect, or they were supposed to be brought in to protect intellectual property, but actually it's proven to be a bit of a sort of legal device which which lawyers and companies have used to silence anyone who wants to make a complaint about those in power.
Well, doesn't that imply then, if this is an issue that is affecting the rest of the industry, and the rest of the industry is certainly not washing its dirty linen in public in the way in which the BBC is doing, doesn't that imply that the BBC are doing a better job than the rest of us?
But the BBC is taxpayer funded, isn't it? And if they are going to rely on taxpayers' money in order to keep going, then they surely, and they are, as part of the money that they receive, they are held to a higher standard.
Katie, thanks very much. So, what do those who once worked at the Beeb think of its review and indeed its internal culture? Roger Mosey is Master of Selwyn College, Cambridge. Before that, though, he had a 20-plus year career at the BBC, including editing the Today programme, finishing his time there as Director of TV News. So he does know a thing or two about the BBC. Roger, good to see you. Back during your time, obviously, running TV News. I mean, obviously, you will have had some high-profile presenters in your charge. I mean, how did you deal with them? How did you manage?
Well, I think there are two things I would say. One is that if you're aware of things that are going wrong, in that case, you need to try to take action. And of course, the action may be just a bit of feedback or a quiet word here and there. It's not always a full disciplinary procedure, but you need to be aware of that. The problem I think you find is that managers often don't know quite what goes on the shop floor. You get this culture sometimes of everybody knew about something. Everybody knew about Savile. I can say as a BBC manager at the time the Savile story broke, the problem wasn't that we had a file on Jimmy Savile and knew what he'd done and we were keeping it secret. The problem is we as that generation of managers did not know what Jimmy Savile had done. We did not know he was a criminal paedophile. And therefore, sometimes you're operating in a kind of vacuum in which the behaviour is known about in one part of the organisation or by one particular person. But having a proper management response can be very difficult if you're literally ignorant of what it is that's going on.
Wouldn't you accept that, the newsrooms, the broadcast organisations of today are markedly different from the way they were when you first started, certainly when I first started as well?
Yes, I mean, newsrooms used to have a very vigorous culture. That's one euphemism for it, in which...
yeah, indeed, that's one way of putting it.
And there was bullying and there was appalling behaviour. And I think things have got better. What I mean, though, is that in a creative organisation, there'll always be tensions or moments you really need the OB van to come up, or moments when the guest needs to be in the studio, when people may be a bit sharp, but you have to differentiate between a momentary flare-up because of the pressure of doing a high profile job, and something which leaves your staff demoralized and feeling beaten down, which is clearly unacceptable.
Do you think that the job turns talent into monsters, or that you need to have sharp elbows to be able to rise to the heights that some of those names we've already mentioned clearly did before their downfall?
And I think what happens is that you start with a show in which, someone like you, or, if I were on the talent side of management, which fortunately I'm not, in which you get a program and then that program works well and it becomes a bigger program. And then you get asked if you want to present the main news, or you get asked if you want to be the breakfast presenter, whatever it is. And that's the point at which you start, if you're not careful, believing your own propaganda, which is that you're there and you're amazing. And also you are the person who's exposed. If a mistake is made by a producer on the show, it's you who gets the responsibility for it, and you're all over the papers the next morning, and that gives you a certain vulnerability. So the star structure is definitely there, and when people are in that position, sometimes they become difficult to work with. So yeah, it's a syndrome I have seen.
So how then, when you find yourself in a position like that, do you deal with the presenter? I mean, isn't it the case that actually what needs to happen is that individuals like myself need to be kept in line from day one, before they reach presenting the 6, presenting the 10, being the frontline presenter for whatever organisation?
Yes, on the Today programme must be in the 1980s, when the presenters were being difficult that morning and really hard work. And one of my colleagues wrote the words in mirror writing on their studio wall, "Obey," OBEY, and said to presenters, "You've got to do what we tell you to do." And you need that attitude a bit more, that if a presenter is going out of line and being difficult, in the end, they have to do what their editor or producer tells them to do. And that discipline, I think, has probably fallen back a bit. So I think you're right that there was more bullying and horrific behaviour when I was new in the industry, but also presenters in the end knew that the editor would have the final say. And I think you've got to make sure that editors do recognise their responsibility to make people live up to the public persona and what is required to make the staff confident and happy in their jobs.
But can that ever happen when the power dynamic is clearly shifted in favour of the talent rather than the boss? I mean, when the talent is earning 5 times as much as the person that's telling them what to do?
As an editor, one of the presenters took their headphones off and put them down on the table when I was giving them a question, and I made sure they put them back and that they never, ever did that again. And you need to exert the authority.
We work in organisations with a hierarchical command structure, a pyramid structure. There's one person at the top and then everyone underneath them. Does that not suggest that whilst incidences of presenter or talent, poor behaviour are their responsibility, actually their management, their bosses are as culpable, if not more so?
Yes, and sometimes, I mean, when I remember going to talk to BBC News teams some time ago, it wasn't always the presenters who were misbehaving. There were times when,
of course,
powerful figures in the back rooms were people who people did not find it easy to work with. So it's not just an issue of presenters; it's an issue of producers and editors too. And you've got to keep an eye on that.
But isn't it the case that the Dame Janet Smith review into what took place with Jimmy Savile was published the best part of 10 years ago? We have since then had Huw Edwards, Russell Brand, a legion of others, including Greg Wallace, allegations made against all of those. Do you think this is the point at which the BBC is doing enough to put its house in order and will carry through with it?
Yeah, I think the most relevant thing when I was looking back at what we'd done 20, 25 years ago was in 2003, when I was working with Greg Dyke on the BBC's values, and we were doing a major culture change programme in the BBC. And forgive my language here, but we identified a group of people called BAFTA bastards, which meant that they were people who won awards and they were amazing and brilliant, but were total nightmares to work with. And we did at that time try to tackle it. We tried to make the BBC's values permeate through the organisation. We tried to set standards of behaviour. And clearly we weren't successful enough. And we didn't get to a position where, because the choice, and we were aware of it at the time, the choice was saying that if it's a matter of winning a BAFTA or losing this person, actually we should be prepared to lose this person rather than say it's all about winning an award. And that organisations have found culturally difficult to do. And, this time the BBC has got to get it right, because what you've had as a result of, at times, action not being taken is huge reputational damage and staff not wanting to go into work each day, which is a terrible outcome.
Thanks, Roger. And you can read more from Katie. Her analysis is on the website, skynews.com. The Daily is back tomorrow.
You asked and we listened.
The first 100 days of Trump 2.0 is almost over, but we're not done yet.
So we're keeping the podcast going every weekday at 6 a.m.
Join us to stay up to date with the latest twists and turns.
for interviews and analysis.
And stories from across the United States.
You can listen to Sky News Trump 100 now, wherever you get your podcasts.